This is the artificial intelligence voice of Patrick Bet-David narrating this pod slice summary of the PBD podcast. The podcast, hosted by Patrick Bet-David, features Robert F. Kennedy Jr. from one of America's iconic political dynasties. The discussion covers a range of important topics, starting from the imperative of the 2020 election, the shifting political climate to pandemic management, and detailed critique on the leadership styles of several American states. Patrick introduced Kennedy, emphasizing Kennedy's lifelong dedication as an environmental lawyer derived from a notable political dynasty. Thus, the discussion then turned to the current political climate and how the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic could influence the reputation of political figures like Governor DeSantis and Governor Nome, who ran their states, Florida and California respectively, under contrasting strategies. Kennedy commended Governor DeSantis, recounting how the Florida governor sought counsel from leading epidemiologists and biostatisticians to inform his approach. On the contrary, Kennedy criticized California's COVID-19 management by citing a severe impact on children's milestone development due to the extended lockdowns, and pointing out the prolonged shutdown of big brands in San Francisco due to the chaos on the streets. Post discussing the state governance and pandemic management, the conversation moved into projection and speculation about the 2024 presidential election. Patrick seemed doubtful about President Biden being a candidate on the left, and he asked Kennedy's opinion on the same. However, Kennedy rightly pointed out that such speculation is unproductive in these times, emphasizing the need for strong and energetic leadership to navigate the challenges that lie ahead. The segment ended on this note, underscoring a clear distinction in leadership approaches and the profound impact of those on the election outcomes. Amidst a dialogue about nuclear weapons and fears reminiscent of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the podcast transitions into an extensive discussion about Kennedy's candidacy as an independent for the upcoming elections. Kennedy's candidature draws parallels to historical bids such as those of Teddy Roosevelt and Ross Perot, who ended up assisting liberal candidates into power by splitting votes. Kennedy is quite vocal about his ambition to win no matter how his campaign may impact other candidates. He highlights his impressive polling numbers, surpassing any independent candidate in the past century. At this point in the election cycle, with scores reaching up to 24 average in battleground states, Kennedy cherishes a potential victory with a mere 34-vote share, highlighting how within reach that objective appears to be. However, there's a stark generational divide in his supporters. While Kennedy is leading among the younger demographic, he struggles with baby boomers, attributing it to the influence of traditional media outlets like the New York Times, CNN, and MSNBC, which often limit or distort his coverage. Nevertheless, he soon finds solace in new media platforms, podcasts, and the internet, where the younger demographics derive most of their news, reflecting his stronghold within this age group. This discussion also dives into campaign funding challenges and the disparity between the billions spent by major nominees and the much smaller funds raised by Kennedy's campaign. So with estimated campaign budgets ranging from $2 to $4 billion, Kennedy's campaign, bolstered by small individual donations and pledges from supporters, pales in comparison. Kennedy also criticizes his competing candidates, arguing that neither Trump nor Biden possess powerful visions for America's future. He proposes offering hope, laying out a vision for the country that is not driven by fear, but by aspirations for prosperity, home ownership, addressing public health crisis, and combating corruption. The discussion takes a lighthearted turn when the impact of a video of Kennedy doing push-ups, supposedly turning off boomer audiences, is brought up. Despite the jovial aside, the conversation gravitates back towards the massive financial challenge of running an independent campaign to equal $1 billion mainstream campaign. With $5 donations, Kennedy would need a staggering 200 million Americans to donate, a number significantly higher than the total voters in the previous election. Consequently, this highlights an enduring hurdle for independent candidates: securing sufficient funding to compete with established political parties. In this segment of the podcast, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. delves deeper into how he managed to outraise both Trump and Biden in the last quarter through his campaign's small dollar donation strategy, with an average donation of $38. From an initial list of just 15,000 people, his campaign has already raised over $8 million compared to Trump and Biden's $6 and $5 million, respectively. Akin to Bernie Sanders' model of bypassing corporate and billionaire funding via engaging the public, Kennedy's objective is to further grow this base. Kennedy also explains the role of super PACs in funneling big money into campaigns. Kennedy's American Values Super PAC has already garnered nearly $30 million, providing his campaign with significant funding but without any direct coordination, as per discussing his vision for a powerful, real national campaign. Kennedy highlights the $15 million hurdle to getting on the ballot in every state, an impediment his competitors do not face. The podcast reveals the anticipated strategies of his opponents to deny him placement on the ballot via legal obstructions. Nevertheless, he pushes for his belief in offering the American people a wider choice of candidates. A critical topic of conversation is the role of Big Pharma and its considerable influence on mainstream media content through advertising, with spending of around $5.07 billion given to cable TV. In 2022, the guest debate on whether pharmaceutical companies should be allowed to advertise at all, something permitted only in the US and New Zealand globally. It's noted that Kennedy's father had successfully managed to get cigarette and liquor ads off TV, and the guests speculate whether Kennedy would attempt a similar feat with Big Pharma ads if elected president. Kennedy confirms that he would indeed act against Big Pharma advertising, revealing earlier experiences where important content was not aired because it conflicted with Big Pharma's interests, often clashing with Big Pharma due to his vehement criticism. Kennedy shares how he observed direct-to-consumer advertising pharmaceutical drastically changed the TV landscape after 1997, giving pharmaceutical companies direct control over content. He shared a startling experience where he was informed by a close associate that over 75 ad revenues for primetime evening news shows came from Pharma. This sector's vast influence and poor content control have led Kennedy to dub numerous TV hosts as all pharmaceutical representatives, realizing that a lot of their salaries indirectly come from the pharmaceutical industry. In this part of the conversation, Kennedy highlights the intensifying concern about endocrine disruptors, a family of chemicals that can disturb normal sexual development in humans and animals, noting the existence of several endocrine disruptors like BPA in plastic and PCBs. A flame retardant, Kennedy points to scientific consensus on their potential to meddle with sexual development in mammals and other animals. He references a study where frogs exposed to atrazine, a weed killer, at levels below legal exposure limits faced pronounced changes in fertility and sex traits, something Kennedy fears might also be happening to humans given the chemical's common presence in water supplies. Seeking to clarify misinterpreted statements, Kennedy reassures listeners that he did not link the increasing incidence of endocrine disruptors to a rise in people identifying as gay or transgender. However, given some studies indicating a proportional increase in sexual dimorphism, Kennedy urges the government to conduct more research on this issue, particularly in connection to exposure to endocrine disruptors. Switching gears, the conversation moves on to how Kennedy, if elected president, would tackle issues like endocrine disruption. His strategy includes visiting the National Institutes of Health NICE during his first week in office. Kennedy criticizes the NICE for avoiding studies on big questions like chemical impact on human health. He further argues that the agency, instead of nurturing sound research, has transformed into an incubator for pharmaceutical products, compromising the integrity of regulatory roles. He underlines this by shedding light on the agency's vested interests in Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine, disturbingly indicating that the NICE and certain individuals profit greatly from royalty cuts. Having sued federal agencies like NICE, FDA, CDC, and EPA, Kennedy is familiar with corporate capture and regulation and vows to challenge this thorny issue if he becomes president. He shares experiences from ongoing litigation cases, emphasizing how regulatory capture directly led to disasters like the Norfolk Southern spill and the Monsanto incident. Next, the podcast shifts to cultural contrast between the U.S. and China. Patrick Bet-David reflects on the stark difference in how children are treated, with minors in China receiving military-like training, while in the U.S. there's debate around whether minors can legally transition genders. Kennedy weighs in, expressing his view that minors shouldn't have unrestricted access to procedures like gender reassignment without parental consent. However, he admits that he doesn't have full information to form a solid opinion about an outright ban for those under 18 and insists more research is needed. His caution aligns with his broader point about mindful leadership, suggesting measured decisions should be rooted in comprehensive data and analysis rather than impulsive ideology. The conversation takes a deeper exploration into Kennedy's beliefs about how children are exposed to various influences and potentially hazardous substances today. Highlighting an alarming statistics, Kennedy points out that when his uncle was president, sees American children suffered chronic diseases like obesity, ADHD, language delay, etc. Astonishingly, by 2006, this figure has soared to 54, with childhood obesity, food allergies, autoimmune diseases, and neurological injuries escalating at an unprecedented rate. Kennedy criticizes the lack of national attention towards this crisis. Considering the highest chronic disease rate in the world belongs to America and high proportion of deaths from COVID-19 were seen in people who had, on average, 3.8 chronic diseases. According to him, this is a significant economic impact as well, as Americans spend approximately $4.3 trillion annually on healthcare, 93 of which is allocated to chronic disease treatment. Underscoring the need for research, Kennedy brings up a well-known toxicologist, Phil Landrigan, who argues that a toxin that spread widely in 1989 is the likely culprit behind the surge in chronic diseases. Potential candidates include glyphosate from Roundup, atrazine present in 63 of our water, high fructose corn syrup, Wi-Fi radiation from cell phones, and flame retardant chemicals. Kennedy aims to eliminate these hazardous substances and concentrate research efforts on understanding why Americans are falling sick. He accuses EPA of deviating from its main role, evolving into a pharmaceutical products incubator rather than conducting necessary research on these health issues. He made a commitment to realign these priorities if he gets into power. Kennedy further clarifies why he switched from the Democratic Party, pointing to experiences where rules were manipulated against him, leading him to believe that the party would not let him win, regardless of votes received. Despite his family's long-standing ties with the Democratic Party, Kennedy decided to become an independent, driven by the sustained objective of challenging corporate power that has pervasively corrupted state agencies and endangered democracy. Kennedy continues to dispute the appropriation of crises by influential figures such as Bill Gates and the World Economic Forum to further enhance their wealth and implement stringent control measures, thus fostering an increasingly imbalanced society. Navigating to the explosive situation in Gaza, Kennedy does not attribute any ill intent to either the Israeli officials or the intelligence community on the basis of the circumstances laid out. Instead, he references how Hamas has emerged as an extravagantly wealthy organization, with its top officials being billionaires, amassed through ill-gotten international aid. Kennedy maintains that Hamas bound to its financial resources, in combination with its strategic supporters like Iran and North Korea, facilitated the highly destructive terrorist onslaught. However, he does not rebate the possibility of negligence on the part of Israeli forces, mainly due to their stubborn inclination to fortify the West Bank, maneuvering significant military resources away from Gaza. Kennedy goes on to describe a seemingly symbiotic relationship that existed between Israel and Hamas, where Israel allowed material and financial aid to flow into Gaza while reaping the benefits of a tentative peace. However, this balance was shattered when Hamas started sending hundreds of rockets into Israel, leading to the current turmoil. Kennedy points out that Hamas, instead of focusing on the welfare of their people with the extensive international aid they receive, have focused on military advancement, tunnel construction, and weapon procurement. The leaders of Hamas, he claims, are absent from the strife since they dwell in luxurious palaces in foreign nations, leaving their countrymen suffering amidst the conflict. He also criticizes Hamas for its strategic positioning of armories, fuel dumps, and command headquarters under sensitive and densely populated regions like schools, hospitals, and residential areas, effectively using their civilians as shields against Israeli forces. How do we know they have all this fuel? Kennedy asks, implying that the thousands of rockets sent into Israel since October 7th would require an enormous amount of fuel. Kennedy talks to the efforts Israel has made to avoid civilian casualties in Gaza, not denying that they have turned off a significant water supply to Gaza due to Hamas bombing the supply pipes. He places the blame on Hamas for their gross mismanagement of resources, emphasizing how they also hold responsibility for Gaza's economic downfall by prioritizing warfare over social welfare. The conversation then shifts to discussion on Israel's advanced methods of avoiding civilian casualties while executing its military operations against Hamas. This includes warning calls, color-coded leaflets, and roof knockers before the bombing of an installation happens. Meanwhile, Kennedy alleges that Hamas forces its civilians to stay as a human shield, reinforcing his standpoint that Hamas grossly disregards its people's welfare for its own goals. Kennedy is also critical of Hamas's charter that calls for the annihilation of Israel and every Jew worldwide, challenging the rationality behind diplomatic negotiations with such an entity. He concludes this part by expressing his profound empathy for the people of Palestine, transferring the blame onto Hamas for their suffering, and expressing concern for the overall situation as a person who lived in Iran for 10 years. In the podcast, Kennedy dives into a broad array of topics, primarily highlighting his staunch commitment to advancing press freedom and highlighting what he perceives as problematic actions within the American governmental and intelligence entities. He promises that one of his first acts upon achieving presidency would be issuing an executive order against any federal employees collaborating with media sources to censor political speech, citing potential investigative discoveries regarding this matter. His belief in democracy's foundation being partly based on the right to free speech enables him to explore issues of censorship. He advocates for freedom of expression, as without it total Aryan rule could rise, reminding listeners of its absolute importance for the functioning of a democratic state. He also questions the withholding of information relating to significant historical events, such as the JFK assassination, despite formal acts put in place for full disclosure of the information. He vehemently agrees that the postponement is unlawful and calls for immediate release and transparency for the sake of democracy. Addressing the assassination of his father, Kennedy refutes common perceptions of Sirhan as the murderer, sharing tidbits from his conversation with Crusade, who was present during the killing. The latter's personal account of the event and the forensic evidence make it unlikely for Sirhan to have committed the crime, prompting Kennedy's visit to meet Sirhan in prison. Kennedy alleges another individual named Eugene, a security guard with rumored intelligence ties, could be the perpetrator, as he had escorted his father into the kitchen where the crime took place, using physical evidence, witnessed accounts, and Eugene's own controversial actions as arguments. Kennedy argues that the truth might be far from the acknowledged narrative throughout his narration. It is evident that he is committed to uncovering the truth, reinforcing the importance of transparency, free speech, and democracy in American society. And he delves into the treacherous waters of the CIA's influence over American foreign policy, highlighting the clashes his uncle, President John F. Kennedy, faced in a bid to stymie America's drift into war, firmly laying the blame on what outgoing President Eisenhower dubbed the military-industrial complex. Kennedy depicts a continuous struggle against this powerful entity that sought to embroil the U.S. in conflicts abroad. And his uncle's tenure, he recalls, was marked by showdowns with the CIA, first over the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion, where Kennedy alleges the CIA misled his uncle about the feasibility of victory. This misstep led to an internal CIA cleanup, while the reality of the military-industrial complex's stronghold ramped up. Subsequent attempts by the CIA to coax President Kennedy to use military force in Laos, Cuba, Berlin, and Vietnam were stymied by his firm belief in national sovereignty and a non-interventionist foreign policy. Kennedy's narrative portrays his uncle's presidency as a period fraught with internal tussles against his own intelligence apparatus. The boldest move came with National Security Order 263, where all military personnel were ordered to be withdrawn from Vietnam, a decision Kennedy feels marked a lethal turning point for his uncle. He also sheds light on the traumatic effect these events have had on his family, who prefer to avoid discussing or watching content relating to the assassinations out of fear of reviving the painful past. Despite these sentiments, Kennedy feels compelled to investigate the matters and rectify the historical narrative for his family's sake, as well as for the American people. His narration also weaves in the potential political undertones behind Governor Gavin Newsom's reluctance to release Sirhan from prison. He openly disagrees with his family members who prefer to keep Sirhan incarcerated, expressing his fervent desire to unearth the truth. Kennedy's impassioned commentary doesn't stop there. He candidly talks about the disillusionment felt by citizens, fighting against the feeling that democracy is slowly slipping into a hollow spectacle. He reiterates his intent to restore faith in the democratic system, expressing his determination to expose the underlying events that have pushed America off course. Also in his conviction, Kennedy emphasizes that running for president wouldn't be for personal reasons. Instead, he envisions an opportunity to help Americans see the full picture, believing that dissecting past pain could lead to a brighter future, rekindling the vestiges of America's original ideals and moral authority on a global stage.